Hi, and welcome to Talking Wildfires. Today I'm here with David Packham, who is a retired fire scientist from Australia. And David was involved with Phil Cheney in some of the very early experiments with fire shelters. And David's going to tell us a little bit about his early experiences and what he knows about why they were developed and how they were developed. Here's David Packham.
Well, thank you, Mike. My contribution is pretty small and right on the edge, but right at the beginning. Now, I was a vacation student in CSIRO in the Bushfire group. I was the second member of the Bushfire group as a vacation student. This was in 1958, December to January that I was there. I was a fairly young bloke at the time, I'm pleased to say. And the section leader was a very clever fellow who at the stage was much older. He was at least 28, and he was a very, very clever chemical engineer. In fact, he had done two PhDs at the Imperial College in London, which was pretty much the centre of chemical engineering education, because he did two, because he completed his first PhD in half the time that anybody else had ever done it. He was a very clever fellow, and Imperial College said, we can't give you your first PhD because you haven't been here long enough. There's nothing wrong with it. It's perfectly up to standard. So he said, I'll do another one. And he did. And that was Alan King. He was really wonderful to work with. Now, being a chemical engineer, he knew about heat and mass transfer. And the first thing that he ever took a big interest in was how much convection, radiation, conduction, and the mass transfer that went on inside bushfire flames. To do that, one needed a special instrument which didn't exist to measure radiation inside the flame mantle. There's many technical reasons why that is very difficult. So that most of the measurements you see about the temperature of a flame inside the flames is wrong, and very few people. And the person who really nailed that was a fellow called Professor Hoyt Hottle, who was the world #1 heat transfer man inside in the combustion area. I think he was at MIT. No, it's Harvard, I think. Oh, yeah, Harvard or MIT, one of the two. And so Alan, to his surprise, found that inside the flame mantle, most of the heat transfer was by radiation. And it was radiation that was damaging and killing people, so that if you can protect yourself from the radiation, then you got much bigger chances of survival. And fresh, clean aluminium is very good at reflecting radiation. 99 or 95, 99%, etc., is reflected, which means that if you have something that is going to be exposed to bushfire flames, you wrap it in aluminium foil or you spray aluminium paint on it, and it'll most probably survive. And so he thought he could apply this to people. Now, the first thing he wanted to know was at what radiation level you start damaging the skin. And he did this himself by rolling up his sleeve and putting it in front of a heater until he could stand the pain no more. And he was measuring the radiation at the time. And he had invented a thing called the King radiometer. If anybody wants to go and measure heat, convection and radiation inside bushfire flames, that is the instrument they should use. It's in the Journal of Scientific Instruments somewhere way back in the late 1950s, I suppose. It turned up. And there's a very good instrument. It's a round brass ball that's filled with water and two heat flow discs on either end. One measures the radiation, one measures and convection, the other one measures the convection. And you subtract one from like a glorified thermocouples. And he formulated some silver body paint, I suppose, as you could find it now. He formulated some of that, put it on, and found that the level at which he could stand the pain no more, and it was very different. So that led to, let's protect firefighters from the radiation, or especially entrapped firefighters. I don't know if there'd been any big entrapments around that time in the 1950s, but something may have sort of spurred his enthusiasm on. And of course, aluminium foil is perfect for that. And so he designed a tent, which was a walking tent. I'm probably not even allowed to mention the name that really inspired him in some ways. He had no connection with them at all, but you know, the stuff that the Ku Klux Klan used to get around in, it looked like that out of aluminium. And so he wanted to test it, and then I was able to assist him by being a vacation student. What assistance I was, I've got no idea, but nevertheless, it seemed to make him happy to have somebody with him when he was doing all this. And we went off to see MacArthur's experiments and to find out more things with that. But coming back, there'd been some very nasty bushfires in East Gippsland. And there were so many of them that the forestry people were totally overloaded, and there was one fire around the Cairn River area that they just had ignored because they had nobody to go to it. And we turned up, and they said, look, as you go back to Melbourne, we call into this fire and see, and give us a radio call and tell us where it is and what it's doing. So we did that. And then Alan said, well, there are a couple of things I want to test. One, burning trees after a fire's been over are very tricky, especially if they're dead trees. They go burning, and they go burning up inside. They form a chimney inside, and they throw burning spots over the fire line that people have put in with bulldozers or with hand lines. So you need to fell these trees. The chainsaw was not really in existence at that stage, just coming to be, but it was also very tricky too, because it would vibrate the tree and make sure a burning limb fell upon you and you were dead. And so he had the idea of using shaped charges of RDX and TNT, RDX explosive, shaped in such a way that they would cut through the tree at the base and fell it. So we wanted to try those. So we were wandering around with a fair bunch of shaped RDX explosives in the back. Australia was a pretty easy place to get on with. There was nobody who was saying that's a legal measure permit. So we tried some of those, and sure enough, it worked, and that was happy enough. But he also wanted to try his tent. So he put on this Ku Klux Klan tent made of aluminium, and with some of the explosive, which I lit up at some end to get it burning, because unless it had been detonated, it would just burn. And it was a very good thing for lighting fires up a bit down slope. You just throw the burning stuff in, and the fire took off, came roaring up the hill, and immersed Alan and his tent. Well, when it had just gone, he was obviously terribly wobbly and about to go down. When I went to him and ripped the tent off him, and then he got some fresh air, because the problem was that he had strengthened the aluminium with fiberglass mat or fiberglass cloth, and that had been glued with a glue that formed formaldehyde when it got really hot. So he was in a very toxic atmosphere. And that is when it was decided that they had to find different glues, and finished up with a silicon glue in it. And that is pretty much, except that I was doing experiments on logs and heat transfer and looking at fire retardant chemicals, of which diammonium phosphate was the one used, but we found a better one, which was ammonium bromide. It was about 3 times more effective than Phosgene, but it was would have to be about 10 or 20 times more expensive. It's a heavy photographic chemical then, not now, seeing most stuff is digital. But that's about my only involvement with all that. And then it went off and Phil did his work with it. Now, my view on the tent is it's exactly like having a parachute in a military aircraft, or a life jacket on a yacht in Bass Strait or the Straits of Malacca or something. They increase your probability of survival, but they won't guarantee it. So, depending upon what you do and where you're doing, and I think the idea that especially in Nevada and Arizona, the smoke jumping there, it's a very good idea to have a tent, because you don't have too many alternatives in leaving the area. But if you can get out of the area and have safe areas to get to, that's better. But if all those options disappear, that is your last option.
David, I have a question for you on this. Something I heard in Australia 20 years ago around Melbourne is that people with fire shelters will actually take more risk than people without fire shelters. And so it's better, they were saying, it was a CFA at that time, that people don't have fire shelters, so they're more risk adverse. What do you think on that whole argument?
Well, I can remember all that, and that was the result of the Ash Wednesday fires in 1983. And I lived in the southern part of the Dandenongs at the time, and our house was burnt over. And during the burn over of the house by a fully developed crown fire, 2 American fire research people were with me that night. They were Chuck George and Dave Blakely from Missoula and Montana. So we all had a very interesting experience. Well, having had the theoretical background, I believed that the fire would be over and gone in a very short time, minutes, 10 minutes perhaps 15, and that during that time the house would not burn down, and our initial shelter from the radiation would take place in the house. And if the house did burn down, and it tried to, but we put it out, Chuck and Dave and Helen and I got in there and chucked buckets of water around the place, and we stopped the house burning down to the stage that we could keep living in it after the broken windows were replaced. And I got involved with the CFA when they would talk to me. They don't talk to me now, of course, in this idea of how do people survive in fires, and our conclusion was, after a lot of work and discussion and theorising and writing equations and calculating and things, that people were safer off in a house than certainly being outside. Well, other people turned up and said, well, look, I've got this fabulous idea for fire shelters. They went from underground bunkers, like the radiation shelters that were generated in America for when the Cold War was getting hot, right up to concrete pipes above the surface, with little chimneys to keep the oxygen in or out or something, and the bucket of water or something for you inside. And it was very controversial, and it has never been resolved as to whether really you can be safe in an underground shelter. I think you can if it is superbly designed, but the problem is because our disaster fires are 30 years apart, you get vast enthusiasm for doing things straight after the fire. In about the conventional disaster, sociology says after 7 years the effect of that disaster has gone and people forget about it. By that stage, the snakes and the rats and the spiders have taken over the fire shelter, and it loses a lot. The perfect fire shelter in the highway situation, I was asked, the Hume Highway that goes between Melbourne and Sydney, a very important road. The road authorities became very concerned about what happens to people entrapped on that in fast-moving fires, and what sort of shelter should they build. My response was they should build public toilets for a couple of reasons, because public toilets are usually built of nice solid brick, and that is a perfect, and usually have a clear area around them for cars to park on, so that the fuel is separated from the building by a nice distance, and they usually have good supplies of water available. And the important thing is that because they have another use, they're available when they're wanted. So the whole question hasn't been absolutely resolved. I would say that if you have a fire shelter, you had better be sure that it is well designed, has been tested in a realistic test situation. The antagonism towards fire shelters came about from the 1939 fires in Victoria, which were one of the very, very, very big ones, one of the sort of three big, really big ones we've had. And there are a couple of things that happened. Mostly it was the deaths that mostly occurred, or a good number of them occurred in sawmills just located inside the forest. In fact, there were some people who perished because they thought they could get protection by getting into the sawdust heap. And of course, the sawdust heap caught on fire. There were another person who decided to jump into a water tank, but the water tank had there is not sufficient heat in radiation and convection to raise even a small billy, the camp kettle, you like, to a temperature that would threaten your life. But if your firewood is stacked under the framework that holds the water tank up, and the water tank framework is made of wood, and it can burn for half an hour, if you're in it, you die, and a person did. And that is where you can't, the myth came that you can't survive in water in a bushfire, to the extent that there are people who feel that jumping into a domestic swimming pool and keeping your head underwater as much as you can, come up for breaths, is unsafe. Well, that is not true, because more than a few people have actually survived that way. So I think the question is a bit vexed. My belief is that a house is a properly, or with a modest amount of preparation, good housekeeping, shall we say, not having, as I saw in California, a foot of pine needles up against a cedar wall. That is another dubious thing. But perhaps river pebbles for a metre or two around the walls, and a bit of, especially fire behaviour education. If people know what they're going to come across, you can't cross a highway if you don't understand how motor cars work and expect to get to the other side. So you'd need to know something about how fires work to guarantee that you'll get there. So I still think that it's better in fast-moving disaster fires where the authorities do not know where the fire is, and that happens. Even if they have it reported to them from the fire line, by the time it goes through the communication network, then goes out onto the public broadcasting system, it is already half an hour old, by which time the fire's gone past. I tried in the Bureau of Meteorology to get the American fire weather radio system that was designed for the Cold War, the Weather Channel, I think you call it, system going here. But I got no support for that, especially antagonism out of the state authorities who do want control of the information flow. But by doing that, they slow the information so far down that it becomes ineffective. An example of that was some fires we had here where a few people were killed, and they had started up in the high country and were not terribly bad, but then the opportunity was taken to add some prescribed burning to it in an unconsidered way, and the meteorology was such that there was a very high-speed, dry north wind, which is the opposite to your south wind, or which is the same as your south wind, across the top. And it looked to me as though the energy produced from the improper prescribed burn would be such as to capable of penetrating the nocturnal inversion layer and bringing that hot wind suddenly down to the surface. But I had decided during the night that I was being hysterical and stupid, and that was not going to happen because it was a very, very rare thing. And I don't know if it has ever happened before. I'm sure it has. But then at 3 o'clock in the morning, I woke up and thought, oh, there's something going on here and it's wrong. Whereupon I flicked the radio on and looked at the temperatures and other things around the place, and the local broadcast station, the fellow who ran the station, which was off at night, came, also thought something was wrong and went in and turned the station on, and I heard the public broadcast, and the conversation went something like this. There are fires burning up in the hills, such and such, and so forth, and they seem to have moved away. Whereupon the woman phoned in and said, yes, the fire is down here, and she was about 25 kilometres away. Whereupon the answer was, it can't be, because I've just had the official notification of where this fire is, and it's still 20 kilometres away from you. How do you know it's down there? Because my fence is burning. So the whole thing, and the person who knows most about this human sociology of disasters is a gentleman called Professor Herman B. Leonard. Now, Herman B. Leonard has 2 donated chairs, professorial chairs, at the John F. Kennedy School of Public Administration in Harvard. And boy, does he know his disaster. He is the world authority on how you transfer information to people and their behaviour that results. And it all comes out, of course, out of the work of Enrico Quarantelli, who was the person who, after the Second World War, when the Cold War was getting hot, set up or provided the intellectual basis for the setting up for the American emergency management system that you have. two fabulous people. We brought Quarantelli out to one of our seminars here in Australia. He was a very, very clever, somewhat overweight, and very pleasant Italian. Does that answer the question about fire shelters?
It does, David, and it leads me to one more. Do you think that joint fire research with international partners in the Australians is a good thing? Or do you think it's better to be insular because that way Australia will find its own answers? I've heard of both over here in Australia. What's your thoughts on this?
Well, I think both of those points of view are correct. There's advantages and disadvantages from both. I think that our problem here in the isolation is that we don't have sufficient science resources to be confident in the way that we go. This argument has been on for a while in a slightly different context. CSIRO was so isolated during the Second War, Australia was so isolated that we had to go our own way. Nobody else was going to help us because they were too busy doing other very serious things. And we were totally unimportant. It wasn't until the Japanese decided that Australia might be a bit of a target for world domination, or at least Pacific domination. And after the war, CSIRO behaved quite independently and pretty much in an isolated fashion and did some very interesting and useful things. So then the bean counters, the accountants and the people with MBAs who came in and came into the science area and said, Australia is too small. It is cheaper for us to ride on the backs of the rest of the world and get our science and our innovation from Britain, America, France, Germany, etc. I thought that was not a good idea. What we should do, and what we were sort of doing at the time, was to developing some really good expertise. Radio astronomy was one. A lot of our agricultural work, the work on shrink-proofing wool and looking after our trace elements for where we doubled or tripled the agricultural output of Australia by just realising what was going on with trace elements or what was not going on. There were areas where we were very, very expertise. We had one of the first digital computers in the world called CSIRO. So we had a lot of capability there. The optic fibre, the Xerox process, they were all developed in this sort of, you're isolated, nobody else will do it for you. What do you do? So atomic absorption, they're all specialties that we did. And I believe that what we should do is to have a wide scattering of people. I remember at university thinking, what's this solid state physics? Oh, who would ever want to know that? Well, that's a useless thing. But we needed to have somebody who knew about solid state physics, which is where the transistor and the integrated circuit came from, who knew about it, who could provide expert advice. So we needed a very thin blanket of every capability with a few strong specialities in the middle. Finland has done that. Their specialty is radio telephones, the Nokia, and the Vasala airborne meteorological instruments, radiosondes. And they're the two special. Well, Nokia not so much now, but the Vasala radiosondes are so good from Finland that nobody, I don't think, even the Chinese, has bothered to try and duplicate them because they just can't do it any better. So that's my feeling, and translate that into fire science. I think we need quite a few people around the area who can converse with anybody in fire science anywhere in the world and swap uh, good information. Professor Michael Reeder is a good example of that. Prof of mathematics at Monash University, applied maths, who has been given the permanent chair in a university in Finland, where he goes and spends the summer in Finland and then comes back here for the summer here with his family. And on top of that, we need a few people who are totally expert in the area. We need to have the capability of providing advice to our politicians and our leaders that you're being sold a pup in this area. This is stupid. And we're not doing that, for example, with the hydrogen economy. We need some good expert advice in there, but it won't be listened to because the pup has already been sold, has already been delivered here. So I think the answer is yes to both questions. It's how you mix the cake.
Well, David, thank you for your talk here about science in Australia and especially bushfire and science and experiments in Australia. It's really unique what you guys have accomplished, especially in the beginning and the early phases. And I'm really happy and impressed that I've had the chance to talk with both you and Phil and capture some of these stories. Thank you again.
Thank you. And it's not just Phil and I. There are many very clever people hanging around the place. Thanks,
Sounds
Mike.
great. I'll try to catch some of them. Okay. Thank you. We're doing this for all of you. If you like what we're doing, please give us a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button, and leave a comment below. See you next time.